Hi, my name is Jeff Whelpley, and I'm here today to talk about building JavaScript web applications so that they not only can be indexed by Google and other search engines, but that they'll actually rank highly. I'm the chief architect at GetHuman.com, and GetHuman is a service that helps customers, any consumers, get customer service faster and easier so you don't have to wait on hold again. Last year, 1 in every 8 people in the United States visited our website. But more than likely, most people don't even know who GetHuman is because they didn't actually go into a browser and type GetHuman.com. I would wager that many of you in this room probably visited GetHuman, but you may not remember it or even know about it. The reason is that most people come through Google, come through search engines. And the typical use case is that you have some sort of problem with a product or service from a major company, and you need to get in touch with a live person to solve that problem. So you go to Google, type in whatever the name of the company is, and phone number, or the name of the company and contact information, or customer service, something like that. And whenever you do, GetHuman will inevitably show up in the top 5 or the top 3, and sometimes even the, oops, sorry. I meant to do Facebook customer service. Even the top 1 and 2 spots. Now, just a little tip, if GetHuman is showing up instead of your website for customer service, more than likely the information on your site is very difficult to reach and isn't helping users as much as it should. But why is that? Why does GetHuman rank so highly? Let's ask this guy. If, for any of you that have been involved with SEO at all, know who this guy is, it's Matt Cutts, who's the face of SEO for Google. And if you ask Matt Cutts, what he would tell you is that the sites that rank highly are those that are very useful for users. That you shouldn't even think about SEO. You should just focus on building an awesome application, and that it's Google's job to make sure that those awesome applications rank highly. Now, I don't think that it's quite that simple, so let's dive into the top 5 factors that go into GetHuman.com's search ranking. With the top one being inbound links. And what I mean by this is actually having a number of sites of high authority, like CNN, Wired, New York Times, write articles about us, write articles about what we do, and then put links to our site. And we have a long history of that, and Google looks at that history, looks at the quality of links, what they're writing about, what the keywords are in those articles, and uses that to help determine some part of the search ranking. The next thing is PogoSticking. Now, how many people could guess or think they know what PogoSticking is when it comes to search? Anybody? No one, okay. So this is something that everyone does pretty much every day. It's when you enter in a search term, go to a website and decide that it's not what you need, so you click the back button, go to another website, that's not what you need, go to back, go to another website. And that process of going back and forth is called PogoSticking. It's something that sends signals to Google about whether a particular site is the answer for your query. Because essentially, when you go back, you're telling Google, that was not the answer for me for this inquiry that I entered. And if Google aggregates that over time for different search terms, they get a pretty good idea of who is actually a good answer for a given search term. And it just turns out that as far as the customer service related queries that I mentioned, GetHuman.com is actually a great, what they call long click. The next thing is performance. Google loves speed, and for good reason. This article came out a couple years ago in the New York Times talking about how 400 milliseconds, the blink of an eye, can mean the difference between users' search behavior. Meaning that if your site, the initial page load is longer than 400 milliseconds, users will start abandoning, users will start searching less, basically. We have a standard at GetHuman that we try, at least, to have our initial server response time under 200 milliseconds and the full initial page load under 2 seconds, both of which are pretty aggressive and may not meet it all the time, but that's what we shoot for both our server-side websites and our client-side web apps, which actually is very difficult. In fact, a lot of client-side JavaScript web applications, this is one of the biggest problems with SEO, that when you have a single-page application, that initial page load is when you download all of your resources, this huge JavaScript file and everything else. And typically, it takes a while. It takes a couple seconds. And then after that, you know it's fast. Your client-side web app is fast. But the problem is when you're trying to have a client-side web app to be SEO-friendly, to rank highly, you need that initial page load time to be just as fast as a server-side website. The next thing is social proof. That just similar to inbound links, when you have people talking about you and talking about what your service provides and the subject matter and then linking to your site, that gives Google an indication that what you're doing is helping people and is a good result for different search queries. The one thing with this I would mention, though, is that some people mistakenly believe that the goal here is just to kind of flood social media with links to your site. And I think if you paid attention to what went down with the Rap Genius fiasco, that's not something that's going to help you in the long run. And the last thing is on-page SEO, and this has to do with everything that you do on your website. The other four things are essentially stuff off your website. You know, it's the links to your site and everybody talking about your site, but the things on your site may not factor in as heavily in the Google algorithm, but I believe that they influence those other four factors, because on-page SEO is really all about UX. It's about how you build the experience on your website to make it easy for users to find things. So the on-page SEO is stuff like, you know, having H1 tags, you know, that have all your titles very large, having breadcrumbs, having a site structure that's easy to navigate, having clean URLs. And that's all provides good UX and helps users on your website, and that's something that Google tracks heavily. Now, with everything that I'm talking about today, I don't want to make it seem like I actually know the definitive truth with any of this. The reality is that Google and other search engines keep the specific details of their algorithms closely held secrets. So it's more like secondary information based off of our experience in making certain changes, seeing how they affect our search rankings and that type of thing. But just like Socrates, the guy in this picture, said, anyone who thinks they know something doesn't really know anything at all. I don't think I know anything, but at the very least, I'm aware of that fact so we can make some better decisions based off of that. And so what we're talking about in this presentation is not really definitive fact. It's more of our philosophy. And it's a philosophy that was formed especially over this past year as we branched out from our purely server-side website that we've had for a while and started to build full-stack JavaScript web applications and started to combine the best of both worlds, our SEO knowledge with a lot of the latest and greatest client-side JavaScript technologies. So the problem at a fundamental level with JavaScript and SEO is that when you're doing a single-page application, the server side returns typically an empty primer page because you have your client that's actually doing the rendering. And so what Google will see is just something like this, where it's just a body tag with nothing in it. Your client is rendering everything, right? But that will basically, when you do this, mean that nothing is indexed. The common solution is to use the Google fragment specification. And I would imagine that a lot of people have heard of the Google's fragment specification. It's basically a process that you indicate to Google that your site is using client-side rendering. So typically two different ways. That what I have up here is in your URLs having the hash bang, or you can also in the head section of your HTML put a meta tag that indicates the same thing. But when you do that, Google knows that it's not going to be able to index anything at that site. So it will instead make a request for escape fragment with whatever the path is. And it's your responsibility on your server with that second request, the escape fragment one, to return exactly what the client is viewing. This is, if you do a search of how do you get your client-side web application indexed in Google, this is almost certainly what's going to come up. And this is not what we felt was best for us. And there are 4 primary reasons for that. The first is that human beings care about URLs. I know that we're geeks. We make excuses for some of the stuff that we do that, it's not that bad or whatever. But there's a lot of studies that go into the fact that creating a very short, clean URL with not any crazy characters leads to more clicks. It leads to a better user experience. If any of you guys have done any work with Google AdWords, you especially know this because every single character in that ad makes a difference in how effective it is. And the same types of rules apply for organic search. Now, like I mentioned, you can do the fragment specification without the hash bang. You can use the meta tag and do HTML5 push state so that it is actually theoretically a clean URL, but most people implement it in this way. The next thing is cloaking. Cloaking is the process of showing Google or another search engine something different, very different than what you're showing your clients. And the origin of this comes from the early days of search engines when spammers would typically feed Google content about diapers or something like that. And Google, this wouldn't typically happen with Google, but more the other, like Alta Vista and older search engines. And then they would index that, and somebody would see the title, it's diapers, and click on that, and then it would be like a porn site. And that practice is taken very seriously by Google. But actually, more recently, it's not just the spammer side of things. It's also the fact that because of the on-page SEO stuff that I mentioned, Google does a lot of measuring of the exact specifics of what's on your page and how that affects user behavior. So when you're showing something different to Google than what the user's actually seeing, Google isn't able to measure that. Anecdotally, and I don't have actually like numbers for this or anything like that, but I've seen a lot of people implement the fragment specification where they do give something radically different to Google through the fragment spec URL than they do with their clients. And besides like being banned, I think that Google, and this is just our belief with this, it's not more of an anecdotal thing, that because that possibility exists and more than likely Google understands that, there's no way that they trust that data coming back from the fragment specification, and therefore there's no way that they can rank that the same way. The next thing is with headless browsers. So actually, I should clarify that headless browsers actually don't suck. They're actually awesome, but for testing. When you're trying to use them to implement the fragment specification, and you sort of need to create a snapshot, they will run on your server and read the HTML generated by your client-side web app and sort of save a snapshot of that. And then you can serve that to Google for that fragment specification request. But it takes a ton of resources, memory, and it's just something you don't want to run on your production server. The only way to legitimately use this solution would be to run it off host or use a cloud service provider like Prerendering or Brombone. But in either of those cases, when you start doing that, you lose your ability to provide Google with an up-to-the-date version of what your client's seeing. You end up actually, especially for the cloud service providers, doing a cache version that's like a day or maybe even more old. For us, that didn't work because once Google starts ranking you somewhat highly, they search your site more and more. And for us, Google is almost constantly crawling our site. And we need the ability to, caching is fine, but we need to have it down to the order of magnitude of minutes rather than days. And it's just infeasible with a headless browser. And finally, probably the biggest issue with the fragment specification is that if you think about the universe that is the web, the number of sites that are using the fragment specification for single-page applications is like a dot on the behind of that entire universe. And that's a problem because Google and other search engines are learning systems. They make predictions based off of the data that they see from other similar websites. If they don't have that data, they don't have the information to back making an accurate prediction, do you think that they're going to err on the side of whatever? Like they'll just throw it up there and have, this site that they know nothing about to be equal ranking with some other site that they can pretty definitively know and trust whether it's spam and whether it's following all their best practices? More than likely not, especially because of some of the other stuff I mentioned where even people that implement the fragment specification don't necessarily do it in the best possible way all the time. So, I went over this presentation with Matthias Niemela, who's Year of the Moo, if any of you guys follow his blog, a member of the Angular core team. And he brought up the fact that, well, maybe, but what if Google actually, because Google and especially the Angular team very strongly believe that the future of the web is on the client side. So maybe, even though all that may be true, they actually are pulling in more data than you think on the client-side apps, and maybe they already have their rendering engine for the client side much more further along than you would think. And let's say that you build a Google fragment specification web app that follows all the other best practices. What if all of those conditions? And I would say that, sure, maybe there's a chance that you could do things perfectly and Google does actually rank you just as well as a server-side application. But if I had to put my money on it, I would say that that's not likely. And furthermore, I just don't like to take crazy, completely unnecessary risks with my livelihood. So what's the solution? What's the answer here? And for us, it's server pre-rendering. It's making your client-side web application act like a server-side website. And what that means is for the initial page load, the server is returning back the actual page, the fully rendered page. In the background, JavaScript downloads and bootstraps, and then for all subsequent clicks, the user is actually interacting with it just like a single-page application. Search engines don't, even though they might render JavaScript for analysis purposes, when they're crawling, they're not crawling using client-side routing ever. They're always doing like a full page reload, so they'll always get the server-side version. So in order to do this, you have to set up rendering on both sides. And so who does this? Twitter is actually the primary example. If you do remember, when Twitter started, they used hashbang for everything. The URLs, every URL they had was, well, almost every URL was hashbang. And in fact, they were one of the primary drivers to get Google to implement the fragment specification. But they changed to server pre-rendering 2 years ago and did it for performance reasons, but it's helped their SEO as well. There's a number of isomorphic JavaScript frameworks out there that you can use. Render, Pete's React is able to do server-side pre-rendering, Derby, and then there's more on the way. I know there's a lot of Ember fans in the room, and I've been talking to some of the Ember guys, and I don't know which release they're going to have it, but they are definitely having server rendering in one of their future releases, which is pretty awesome. But you don't see Angular on there. So at ngConf a couple of months ago, I tracked down Misko, who's the father of Angular, and asked him about the server rendering. And what Misko said is that they actually did explore building a Angular server renderer and had something working, but they ultimately dropped it because they believe that the future of the web is on the client, which kind of sucks. But at least he said that they had it working, so it can't be that tough. Well, yes, it can. It's actually very tough. I spent probably the better part of a month just focused on trying to build this, and I know SEO really well, I know JavaScript pretty well, I think, but I think ultimately threw in the towel because there were so many unknowns trying to build an isomorphic JavaScript framework without having all of the intimate knowledge of how JavaScript should be able to render on both the client and server. So I picked myself up and I tried something different. instead of creating this ultimate framework, I just wanted to do something quick and dirty to get something working. And what that meant is essentially doing something more in my wheelhouse of creating an Angular app, just a normal Angular app, as if you forget about this server rendering stuff initially, but then go route by route for the client-side routes and literally duplicate the rendering logic that's in Angular onto the server side, onto a node controller and template. And so what that started to look like, just to give you kind of an example of some of the code for the routes, it was important to define routes and use the Angular UI router on the client side such that I had a common routing configuration file that was used for both, because when you're doing something with SEO, like I've mentioned a couple times already in this presentation, URLs are very important. It's very important to have clean URLs. It's very important to have everything URL driven. And actually, one thing that I do like a lot about Ember is that they sort of think along those lines as well. And so I created a sort of abstraction on top of both the Angular UI router and the Express, on the server side, the Express router, so that I could define a bunch of routes and then feed it into both of those routers. One thing that was important in building the Angular app, even though initially I wanted to just build a client-side app without worrying about the server side and just get the functionality working, I did make a strong effort to do things from a component-focused way, that I didn't just build like an entire page for a route, have like one controller that did everything. It was important to break things down into very small components, because if I was going to copy the code over and translate it to the server side, it's much easier to translate like 20 to 40 lines of code than like 200 or 2,000 lines for like an entire complex page. So starting to get into like the duplication of the actual components, and at the controller level, you can, I'm not going to go over all the code, but just to give a sense of how, if you look at the server and client side, it's somewhat similar, but somewhat different. And this is like really, once I started doing this, like I got really excited because number one, it worked. Like it would actually render on the client side, it would render on the server side. But as I was doing this, I could see what the difference was. I could almost envision in my head then, for the next iteration, how I could refactor this so that I can actually create that isomorphic controller that can do both. Same thing with the templates. And don't get thrown off by, we have a custom JavaScript templating engine that we use. So it's not HTML, it's JavaScript for the template. But similarly, it's somewhat similar, but instead of ngIf, we have like a server-side if function and ngRepeat in our server-side each function, etc. So let's do a quick demo. So I built, we haven't moved over GetHuman.com yet, but I created a application that's for doing questions and answers. And initially, if you go to server true that I have on every page, you'll see the server-side version of the page. I purposely turned off on the right side the related search results so that you can see the difference, that without or with the server equals true rather, where it's just the server version, it's pretty much the same thing other than what I kind of turned off, and also like the login in the upper right-hand corner. But when you go to the actual thing, it has all the content. And so you probably didn't even notice like any flashes or anything like that, because literally the HTML is exactly the same. So the client side, when it takes over, does re-render the page, but it doesn't actually like do any weird like moving around of the HTML or any, of the actual elements or anything like that. Okay. So up next is to do, and actually this is something I've been working on for the past month and probably will be for another couple months, which is taking what is actually working now. I should mention that the answer site is still in beta. We're still doing a couple things before we actually launch it officially, but you guys can feel free to check it out. But I've already started working on our next version, which is taking that duplicated content then, and which obviously for the long term, maintaining both of those is probably infeasible. and doing the refactoring to create those isomorphic controllers that can be rendered on both sides and isomorphic templates, etc. For takeaways, I tried to boil things down to 4 things, the 4 I's. So intrigue, before anything, just remember that as far as SEO goes, you have to create intrigue. You have to create an awesome app. If you don't have that, if people aren't interested in your app, then more than likely your SEO efforts are not going to do very much. Initial page load is very important for SEO, like I mentioned, and we believe that the server pre-rendering is a better solution for ranking highly than the Google fragment specification. Isomorphic, using the isomorphic JavaScript frameworks is a way that you can accomplish that. I don't necessarily recommend people doing what I did, especially not creating a server-side version of Angular. But there's obviously a number of frameworks on that list that you guys can use. And I mean, React is probably the best one that's available right now. And once Ember comes out with their server-side renderer, I'm sure it'll be great too. And finally, iterate. Just from a general software development standpoint, I learned a lot with this past year about not necessarily going for that perfect solution right from the start and just getting something working. It's helped tremendously in this case to get something somewhat ugly but very functional, and from a user standpoint they don't know the difference. And then with the subsequent iterations, it's becoming more of an exercise than an experiment. It's actually just executing on doing that refactoring. I'd like to thank a lot of people that helped me kind of reviewing my presentation and giving me some great feedback, and have some links. And the last thing I was going to mention is just I did post a blog post on my website, jeffwhelpley.com, which I put all the slides and a lot of commentary and links and that type of thing if you guys are interested. But that's it. Thanks a lot. I think I have 2 minutes. Thanks.